Thank you very much. Thanks, Brian. I should, first of all, thank RTI and Elon for making this event possible, and in particular to Lee Rainey and Brian Southwell, who've done so much to bring it there. I'm delighted to be here, albeit virtually. The background, in case you're wondering what it is I asked DALL-E to imagine the library that should have been in the movie Blade Runner, but wasn't. And actually thinking about that might help to get our discussion started. So I'm here because for my sins, I wrote a book called The Line, AI and the Future of Personhood by MIT Press, published last year. It's available for, it's under open access. It's under Creative Commons license, so you can download it for free. The link should be in the chat for those of you who are virtual, but you can easily find it if you Google. So when I tell people that I'm writing a book about AI, it turns into a kind of Rorschach blot. They say, you must be writing about privacy. And I say, no. They say, okay, I get it. You're writing about skewed models, racial discrimination, insensitivity, and the results. Like, no, not writing about that either. You must be writing about the potentially devastating effects that it might have on the labor markets, not just replacing human workers, but sometimes replacing humans with inferior technologies, which are, however, much cheaper to run. I was like, no, fascinating topic. I thoroughly agree. Not writing about that either. You're writing about cheating. No, I'm dealing with cheating as a professor, but no, I'm not writing about that either. Wait a minute, you're a lawyer. You must be writing about copyright law and fair use and whether or not training all of these models was actually a fair use or copyright violation. Be happy to talk to you about that. It's part of my day job, but no, that's not the book. What the book is about. And all of those books, all of those topics and many others, which I think you will talk about today, are fascinating. They're important and they're extremely salient. I'm just contrary, and I decided to write a book about something that I didn't think people were talking about, which is AI and how it will affect our understanding of personhood, both our own personhood, and I don't just mean legal rights, I also mean the nature of consciousness or whatever gives us the entitlement to a heightened moral status, our relationships with other entities, including perhaps non-human animals. It will give us insights on corporations. After all, we have artificial persons already, and we give them legal rights. And we don't always think that those legal rights are good ideas. Some people will be saying, yes, that's really, really dangerous. It will give us insights onto our place in the world. Humans have a certain exceptionalist view of ourselves. We look at the world and we see ourselves as different from things, as from non-human animals, and from mere machines. And it will cause us to challenge those lines. So that's what the book is about. And that's why it's called The line that we draw between subject and object, between persons and things. In 2010, which is the Jurassic era in AI time, I gave a talk to a bunch of distinguished federal judges. And I asked them to imagine that there were machine entities that plausibly seemed to possess many of the characteristics that we think entitle human beings to the moral status that they have, that they had some notion of morality, that they had some form of consciousness, that they were highly linguistically able, that they could engage in unstructured dialogue with us and find us saying, I can't tell whether this is a person or a machine, that they would have some notion of projects, that they would have some notion of self-expression. And I asked them just to imagine as judges, well, if you kept on adding those capacities, at what point would we as a society and at what point would our law start to ask, should we be treating these entities differently? Should we not be treating them as kind of mouthy toasters? Should we be treating them, in fact, as conscious entities? Should we even be giving them some kind of rights so that we don't just treat them in the same way that we treat an office chair or a light that can be turned on or off? The judges looked at me. They were very polite, and they said, they clearly thought it was nothing but the most ludicrous science fiction. One of them said, rights are from humans and only humans. And another one added, rather quellingly, naturally born of women. So with that rather biblical incantation, we began our discussion I pointed out to them that as a species, human beings have a pretty bad history of dealing with personhood issues. We have denied personhood to members of our own species. We've denied it on the basis of sex. We've denied it on the basis of race. We've said that you're not fully a person, that you're a thing, that you're something that may be owned and controlled, something that, even if you are a person, should have no rights. And those moments in the past have not been our finest hour. We look at them now, in many cases, I think, with shame. And we haven't stopped fighting about personhood. We still fight about when life begins and when life ends. And those fights are intense and heartfelt, and they're going on right now. What happens, I ask them, when you add in this possibility of a machine entity which has many of the capacities that we think are what makes us special? They clearly thought, as I said, that this was nothing but the most arrant science fiction. Well, it's 15 years later, and while I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, I think on this one, I have a pretty good track record of saying something that actually now, even if it is not here, the moment has not arrived, ChatGPT is not conscious, it is not in any way conscious right now. Even if the moment has not arrived, it nevertheless seems much more plausible that that moment might one day arrive. When the judges pushed a little back, I said, look, supposing you had in front of you Mr. Spock on the one hand and Commander Data on the other from Star Trek, but suppose that those entities actually, suppose their backstory was not fictional but true. What would you do with them? Would you say, well, you're not human, or only partially human for Mr. Spock, so I don't need to give you any rights, and you're a machine, Mr. Data, Commander Data, so I don't need to give you any rights either. Would you send them off to the gulag, the salt mines? And they said, well, I mean, it's science fiction. I said, yeah, but thought experiments are science fiction. If you believe, and not everyone does, that your consciousness is material, that it is going on inside your head, and indeed, as the doctors tell us, inside our own bodies, our whole bodies, how would you draw that line? Well, human beings have spent pretty much since human beings started philosophizing, they've been philosophizing about what makes us human. 2,300 years ago, Aristotle said, fundamentally, it's language. Language is the thing that distinguishes us from the brute beasts. Language gives us the ability to reason instrumentally. I'm hungry. I can see some grapes up there. I can't reach them, but if I stood on this piece of wood, I might be able to grab them, and then I would be able to eat them and satisfy my hunger. But Aristotle went on, it doesn't just allow us to reason instrumentally, it allows us to reason ethically. I look at the grapes and go, oh, those are Lee Rainey's grapes, and he loves grapes. And I shouldn't really take them without his permission, should I? That's moral thought. And Aristotle said, and that those conjunctions, instrumental and moral, allow us to form a third wonderful thing, community. And in particular, the things that Aristotle cared most about, namely the family on the one hand and the city-state on the other. Not just groups of people, groups of animals, but groups with a moral foundation and connection. So, language, he said, that's what makes us human. Well, we now have produced machines which, whatever they don't have, and I will say again, at the moment, they do not have consciousness. They certainly have language. They have so much language. So how do we deal with that? We have always thought that whatever made us human, a part of it was about the ability to engage in abstract thought using highly complex language. That was at least an important part of it. What happens now that that view has changed, now that we're no longer unique? We can no longer believe that sentences imply sentience, and that is an enormous change. As a result, what we're doing more and more is probing the nature of our own consciousness, and this is happening in the sciences with neuropsychological theories like global neuronal workspace theory or integrated information theory, trying to explain how consciousness actually comes out of a set of material processes. It's going on in the arts, it's going on in philosophy. 2,200 years after Aristotle, Alan Turing tried again. How do we find the moment when machines start to think? And his answer was the same. It's language. It's the ability to engage in sustained, unstructured conversation with another person. And if you can't tell whether that entity is human or a machine, Turing says, at that point, you have to say it is capable of thinking. Why? Because otherwise the machine could say, well, if I'm not thinking, then what are you doing? And how come you're in a better position to judge me than I am to judge you? And so with that answer, not quite an answer, but more of a riposte, a judo move, Turing said he thinks that language will be the key. Well, here we are. We have machines with language. And so now as we think about it, we're going, yeah, but it's not the language, it's the interiority with which I use the language. Picasso paints Guernica and gives us a searing picture of the Spanish Civil War. If Dali painted Guernica, it wouldn't mean anything. I mean, it would be a picture, but any meaning would come only from us. But might that ever change? Some computer scientists, some neurophilosophers have talked about the possibility of embodied intelligence, of a computer system, a machine that learns as we learn by encountering the world physically as well as through symbols. Something that might one day be able to understand not just syntax, which is what ChatGPT understands, but semantics, the meaning behind it. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the encounter with this technology, which in one way is the worst technology to think about consciousness, because it contains many of the qualities that we think go to consciousness and yet has no consciousness itself, this encounter with that technology might spur us to reflect on our grounds for moral exceptionalism, to say, no, I am different. We are different. And can that line just be drawn on the species line? The more you think about it, I think the harder it becomes morally to sustain that problem. Fine now, but what about later? Then the second point that I came to, I said, okay, so this is really this encounter with machine intelligence or machine learning will teach us about our interaction between our empathy and our ethics. We all have this tendency to anthropomorphize. I talk to my Roomba, which is borderline insane. But we also have the tendency, the regrettable tendency, to be able to distance ourselves from others, to say, you're not really human, or you're not the same color as me, you're not the same religion as me. And thus, that you're not real, that I don't have to take your views into account. And that's one of the most hateful tendencies in human history. It's the oscillation between that over-anthropomorphization and that under-anthropomorphization that I think will guide us in the future. So if that's one thing that this might teach us, and that's something that surely the humanities should be reflecting about, and the sciences should be reflecting about, the second one is very different. We already have, as I said, artificial entities that have personhood. They're called corporations. And you probably have a view on that, whatever your politics are, whatever your ideology is. You probably look at that and go, you might say, well, I think, sure, corporations should be able to make deals, but do they really need these constitutional rights? If you think about it a little bit more, you might go, well, sometimes maybe they do. I mean, Elon, Duke, NC State, UNC, they all, as institutions, have First Amendment rights. And in this world, they very possibly may need them. So yes, we sometimes give institutions rights, even constitutional rights. But will we do that with these new entities? People already think that corporations are soulless, amoral entities driven only by the profit motive, that are immortal and in some sense superhuman and tend to grind up humans in their treadmills. That is a popular critical view. What will that view think of when we have the first time when we say, it might be a good idea just to give this AI some form of personhood, not because we empathize with it, not because we think it is our equal, but because we want it to be able to sue and be sued. Because we think it's a convenient way of doing business. That's why we give corporations rights. It's not because we empathize with them. What dangers would there be? What regulatory agenda should we set up? How should we think of this? Are we only protecting our own interests, or are we perhaps protecting also the interests of the entities themselves? And do we, as soon as I bring up that possibility, flip the valence of the political debate? I started by talking about empathy and ethics, and you probably thought, oh, so this is, he's presenting this as though this is the next move on the liberal path of enlightenment. Gradually, we extend our rights. We finally move it from, rich white men to all white men to white women to all men to all women. And gradually, that process, this expanding sphere of rights, that is the great purring monorail of progressive enlightenment. That's history on the march. This is the next step where I have to look at my silicone brethren and see not the color of their metallic carapace, but the contents of their consciousness. And so you might think, wow, maybe I should start thinking that way. But as soon as I brought up the corporation point and the idea of immortal entities, you go, wow, this sounds more like Terminator than it sounds like a moral injunction. This makes me worry. This makes me think that this is going to be Citizens United on steroids. That actually, this is something where I need to worry about these entities being given extra rights, legal protections, immunizations that we do not have. And so that debate, I think, is thoroughly as queued up for us. The EU already in 2016 started talking about the possibility, they didn't come to any conclusion, of giving some form of limited legal liability to certain highly advanced robotic entities, just for the purposes of convenience. Most people respond and go, no, you can't do that. Human rights are for humans, just as my judges did at the beginning of the lecture. So if the first point is that this will teach us to reflect on our consciousness, both as a scientific matter, a philosophical matter, as a spiritual matter, and force us to deal with the limits of our empathy and our ethics, force us to deal with human exceptionalism. And if the second theme is that this will force us to think about corporate personality, which it turns out we still don't have figured out very well. If you're interested, you can read all about that in the book. The third theme is perhaps the deepest of all. It was the one that came to me latest as I was working on the book, which is we need to see this as a mirror. That this moment in history is something which could have as great an impact on our vision of our role in the world as evolution did to the Victorians. If you were a Victorian and you looked at this new science from Darwin and his ilk, you said, this cannot be true. I'm just highly evolved pond scum. Pond scum has no rights. Pond scum has no soul. How can I, according to you, merely the evolutionary descendant of that process, have the status that I think of myself? How can I see myself in the world? How can I set human beings on top of non-human animals? It was a crisis of conscience. For many of them, it challenged their religious faith. Many deeply religious people found ways of incorporating the idea of evolution into their own spiritual practice and now are very confident in that. But at the time, it was seen as an enormous disruption. We are potentially, and I want to stress potentially, facing an equivalent moment. And the moment is the moment when we realize that we have here entities which possess many, but not all, of the qualities that we value in ourselves, that we think give us higher moral status. And so if we're defending that line between us and it, between us and animal, how are we going to draw it now? How do we think of ourselves? There are multiple possibilities. One is we might say, we'll just deny it. We'll be like the judges say, rights are for humans, end of story. There are philosophers who tried to do that, John Searle among them. I discuss them all in the book. You can dig in there if you're interested. Bottom line, they all deploy the arguments that the critics of evolution used against evolution, and it is worth noting that those critics were wrong. They say, well, you can't, from unthinking things, you can't have thinking things. Just like from unthinking protozoa, you couldn't possibly have me giving you a talk. That one turned out to be wrong. Maybe this one is too. So the mirror being turned back to ourselves, asking ourselves, how do we think about human art now? How do we think about human consciousness? How do we think about moral status? I think that, ironically, might be one of the greatest contributions that this has, that it gives to us at this particular historical moment, that the machine with no consciousness at the moment prompts us to think about our own, and that the fact that we have progressed so remarkably rapidly over the past 5 years alone makes us realize that our ability confidently to predict, either optimistically or pessimistically, about the future is remarkably limited. The future systems in AI may look nothing like our present ones, and they may push us even further. The second possibility is that we can not just say, oh, we're human and we don't need to care about anyone else, nana boo-boo. The second one is no, actually, maybe we're just kind of like ChatGPT. I mean, all of us have days when we're just kind of running on scripts. I'm a professor. What do? Read lots of books, internalize them and regurgitate them out against the helpless and defenseless young. That sounds kind of like what ChatGPT does. We learn from reading the best. We practice our art by copying old things. We do lots of things ChatGPT does. Maybe this has been sent to humble us. B.F. Skinner said, the question is not whether machines can think, but whether men do. That's turning the mirror back on ourselves with a vengeance. That's the pessimistic answer. So there's the speciesist, the pessimist. And the third one is the one that I prefer, which is critical reflection. We haven't got it yet. We haven't fully managed to explain what it is about human art that makes it art. We haven't fully managed to explain what it is about human beings that gives them moral entitlements. But we can do so. In the book, I offer you some ways of thinking about that, and they are ways of thinking about it, not the right way to think about it. This is a humanities book. It's about how to think, not what to think. You can look in the book for my answers. I end up adopting a hybrid view in which all human beings are inside our line as of right, regardless of whether they're in a coma or whether they lack brain activity. But in addition, entities which plausibly have the qualities which we believe entitle us to moral status. Those entities too have rights. So for me, those are the three lessons that we're maybe ignoring as we worry about all the things that we should be worrying about. I'm particularly sad that Beth Novak couldn't come and talk today because the issue of AI and democracy and the challenges to democracy that we currently face is perhaps one of the most important issues. And I hope that even in her absence, attendees of the conference will start thinking about that and debating it thoughtfully in a non-partisan but rigorous way that actually confronts what we're going through right now, which is an exceptional moment in American politics and not entirely a positive one. But as well of those worries and concerns, and I share all of those worries and concerns, my hope is also that we manage to capture that faint sense of wonder that finally there are entities that plausibly could lead us to think that one day we might greet another intelligent entity, another entity that worries about where to draw the line onto this planet. And that in that moment, there's surely a sense of wonder. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I really appreciate it. I'm not sure if you're able to hear the robust thanks for your talk. Here you've given us an awful lot to think about, lots of food for thought, in addition to Lee Rainey's grapes, for us to gather and think about. We are going to have an opportunity to have both questions from the room here. So we do have some microphones that will be circulating, and we have questions that are starting to come in, online as well. So if you just raise a hand, a person with a microphone will find you. And Jamie, if you can stay with us for a bit, we really appreciate the opportunity to entertain some questions here from the room. I know that we've got a question that's come in online as we're gathering questions here in the room. And so I'm going to turn to you, Shane, for that first question.
Thank you, Brian. First question is, what is the benefit to creating a being with legal status as a person in this capitalistic structure? Doesn't it simply introduce a superior competitor in our post-industrial food chain?
It's a great question, and certainly one that I reflect on a lot in the portion of the book that's about corporations. I think that's a very real danger, but I think that there is an alternative way of looking at it. If what we're doing is simply giving legal cover, a legal flak jacket, effectively, a limited liability corporation shawl wrapped around the contours of an AI system, then it could indeed be exactly it could bring up exactly the danger that you have. But it's also possible that we have a range of AI designs, and that the AI designs that we could do could push for more or less, greater or lesser degrees of consciousness, of intelligence, etc. In that world, you could imagine, and this is the whole alignment debate inside the AI community, that it might be possible to create beings that were aligned with human interests that one day would be partners, not slaves. I'm particularly excited, even now, with our decidedly non-conscious AIs, about the potential for scientific advances. I've been associated with an organization called Creative Commons for a long time. One of the things that we wanted the most is to free scientific inquiry so that hidden in our journals are all these nuggets of insight that could be stitched together in order to produce innovations that save lives, that produce wonderful medicines, that produce better technologies for dealing with environmental problems. It's there already, perhaps, sitting in our scientific literature, but how do we find it? One of the things we wanted to do is to make scientific literature open access so that people could search that literature, and we've made some progress towards doing that. But this is something that we now already can see the possibilities with AI scientific systems, actually finding insights that human researchers had not managed to put together. And this, I think, is something that Eric will probably mention in his talk, which I look forward to. It seems to me that if you start thinking about it that way, you could imagine a dystopian future, which is very much the Skynet future, living up to the reality that you were describing. But you could also imagine another future, a future of actually entities that have capabilities we do not, and that use those capabilities for our benefit as part of a partnership rather than as part of a command economy. And I think the interesting thing is we'll pick which of those future lines we go down. And I'm suggesting in the book that we think very hard. Thanks very much for the question.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. We have a number of questions that have started to pop up here in the room, and so we'll move to that in the back. Yeah.
This is Mustafa Akben from Elon University. One of the questions I have, when we talk about entities, they are singular entity. We don't have another Duke University copy-paste in a different part of the world. We don't have another Elon University copy-paste in a different part of the world. Let's assume we just managed to develop these sentient beings, and there is a possibility these sentient beings are going to be copy-paste in different machines and they run in the different platform. How are we going to make these, entities right? Who's going to be responsible if anything goes wrong? Is going to be the same entity are we going to talk, or the replica of those entities?
Well, you raised multiple questions there, I think. The first one is, how do we deal with the possibility of identity when with digital systems there may or may not, it depends on the technology, be the possibility of plausibly creating a perfect digital reproduction of a, quote, personality. We've not had that word. Now, the slight pushback on your comment, Duke has tried very hard to create a version of Duke in another country. It's called Kunshan, but leaving that aside, I think that there's a possibility that we would have to deal with that. And there, I think what we basically need is a strong idea about version control, something that open source computer scientists can help us with. Something like GitHub is like, who am I dealing with? What am I dealing with? And when are such entities allowed to be copied? When are we forbidden from creating such copies? The second possibility, the second question that you raise is the question of affixing liability. And we know, because of our experience with corporations, that there are multiple ways that we can go wrong with liability. If you underprotect, if you allow corporations to shield assets so that the machine that hits you is backed by a shell corporation which conveniently has no assets that you can sue, we know that corporate personality can be used as a way of preventing human beings from vindicating their rights through compulsory arbitration, et cetera, et cetera. And that's obviously something that we should be worried about here. So I think we should be extremely attentive to that danger. But we also know that if we impose liability too much, if we penalize people who start businesses, make bets and lose and then go bankrupt, then we're not going to get innovation, because innovation depends on making bets and not all bets pay off, which is why having gone bankrupt in Silicon Valley is not a stigma of moral shame, but rather kind of a badge on your shoulder. It's like, yeah, I've had 3 companies gone to the first level of funding and, flamed out. But, obviously I'm a person who has the ability to create these companies, and maybe the 4th one will be Uber. So I think what we would have to do is set that balance of rights and liabilities. And that's assuming that there's not any moral component to the analysis. But if you actually thought there was a moral component where I actually have to worry that this is an indentured servant that I'm not treating well, then that adds an entire 3rd level of regulatory activity. My suggestion is we start thinking hard about those issues now, rather than when the technology is fully developed and a number of people have strong vested economic interests in picking answer A, answer B, or answer C. Great question. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. I know we have another question here in the room, and I know there's some online as well, but Jeff Alexander.
Yeah, thanks very much. Jeff Alexander with RTI, professor. I'm curious, with the rise of agentic AI, right? We have agents that are making, for example, purchasing decisions on our behalf. Is there a precedent for considering a person and an AI as a single entity for personhood and legal rights? That basically the AI would just be an extension of my personhood, as opposed to them having to be treated as separate entities?
Great question, and absolutely. In fact, if you think about it, we already have high-speed stock trading programs in which effectively we have handed over to the algorithm the ability to make and the right to make financial decisions, to make enormous consequential economic bets at speeds that no human beings could comprehend. And those deals, which are already made without very, very clearly not conscious at all, it's not even AI, it's just a smart algorithm, those clearly give rise to legal liability. There's no doubt about it. Those are binding contracts. So we wouldn't even have to go far for that to happen. Now, I think there are really interesting questions about agentic AI, which I think has the promised land has perhaps not arrived quite as quickly for agentic AI as we were led to believe that it might. And that's, to be honest, what's going on a great deal right now in AI, because we have to understand we are in the middle of a complete bubble frenzy. We just don't know which portions of the bubble may burst first and which portions of the bubble are actually the seeds of the future. So in a world like that, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for us to correctly draw the lines of liability. But we already have the tools in agency law to do so, which is basically to say, we understand that under certain you can give power of attorney to something, you can give whatever to it, and then the question is, did it implement your instructions properly? Was the programmer negligent in writing the agent? In which case the programmer might have some liability. Or did you negligently give the instructions to the agent so that it, like the sorcerer's apprentice, it did literally what you asked to do, which really wasn't what you wanted to do, in which case perhaps you own the responsibility. But those are legal tools and moral tools we've had for centuries. And I actually think there we can get it right, though it will be very hard to do so.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. I know we have a couple more questions in the room, but I'm going to turn to online. Shane?
Thank you. The question is, how can we give personhood to a machine and anthropomorphized system before all humans have personhood, especially when these are not the thoughts of a machine, these are the accumulated and curated thoughts of the systems?
So it's a great question, and I see there's a second part to it too. It's a great question. I think that that's one of the things that serious philosophers about this worry, that we may get distracted by the shiny bauble of the moral conundrum of whether we could ever give rights to machines when we haven't finished the pressing task of extending human rights to all humans, effective human rights to all humans. Many human beings in this world are denied the ability to engage in full human flourishing in a way that I certainly think is morally insupportable. And no, we should not allow our eyes to be taken away from that focus. But on the other hand, the very thing that allowed us in the past to have a moral openness that said, though you are not like me, though you have a different religion than me, though you have a different race than me, though you have a different nationality than me, I nevertheless must respect you as a human and say that you have all of those rights here. And the question that I was posing is, are we happy just drawing that line around the species like a DNA test, and there's no DNA, then there's no rights? I think that's a morally unsatisfying solution. So I think what we have to do is say that the very things that lead us to even contemplate extending rights to enter strange entities that we will in this coming century create, stranger far beyond what I conjure up in the book, should also lead us to look back and say how terrible it is that we don't extend those very same rights to members of our own species. I actually think in some ways it might be a spur to greater activity, in the same way as people who agitated for the rights of non-human animals found their moral antennae being more attuned to the rights of other human beings.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. I know Scott Brennan, I think, had a question. Yeah. Do you have a microphone?
Hi, Georgi Babashev, RTI. I have a question about ownership and punishment. And so you're talking about liability, but we're now seeing situations when people using AI, say like ChatGPT, and commit suicide, and because they believe that instructions that they received from AI led to that. But the question is about ownership. So who owns that? And it's probably related to the previous question about liabilities, is that who gave the instruction? So is it OpenAI owns that instruction? Is that the agent that the person created owns it? But then a couple of days ago, we had a discussion that pushed it even further. We thought, okay, can we have agentic or AI CEO of the company? And then pushing it further, can AI own the company or own land, own other things? So how do you see the legal system moving into ownership and punishment? So like if somebody punishes me, puts me in the jail, I'll be suffering enormously. But how do you punish AI agent? So, you know.
Well, great questions. I mean, I think basically what you just laid out was a syllabus for a year-long course, I would say, not a semester. So I can't possibly argue all of them, respond to all of them, but I'll give it a shot. The first is that we do have ideas about responsibility and negligence, and when the designer of a product is responsible for the harms that the product is used, when the user also plays a role. Those concepts exist and can be modified to this environment. Whether they will be in a good way, I think, is a separate question, but they can be. We can talk about whether it's reasonably foreseeable that if you have created a chat GPT or what have you without sufficient guardrails, that it would give instructions such that an individual might use it for self-harm. But there we also have to look at the responsibility of the individual, and we have to look at the fact that, and this is what the AI companies worry about, that liability would potentially be without end. That it would be so hard to prove causation, and that it would be so hard to prevent every kind of ill that we would risk not developing the technology at all. But those are all the kinds of debates that we have had about previous technologies, although I acknowledge that this brings in extra complexities. In terms of ownership, separate question. Right now, of course, these entities are largely the property of the corporations that created them. And that will clearly be the position of, I think, many, perhaps most corporations, regardless of whether or not AI in the future is most plausibly is actually giving some signs of consciousness or personhood, where we're thinking now it really seems weird that Sam Altman says he owns this being, which is which has actually convinced me that it is very much like me. So that's, I think, a question. In terms of your issue about the CEO, it's quite likely that we will have, regardless of whether we get, excuse me, conscious AI in any form, that we will have very good expert systems, which perhaps in certain kinds of corporate decisions might outperform human beings. And there, the most likely response is that we allow the CEO to keep the corner office and perhaps even the private jet. But everybody knows that the decisions are actually being made by HAL, the expert system. We already do that. with high-speed stock trading. So we could certainly do it here. You could even imagine some companies saying, no, we're the artisanal company. We're proudly and incompetently run by actual human beings with their fallibility, stupidity, biases, and prejudices. It would be like the badly shaped candles that are handmade that you can buy at Whole Foods, artisanal human governance. So I think all of those possibilities are real ones. But again, that's a regulatory debate I want us to get into now, rather than when there are companies, et cetera, with strong vested economic interests really pushing the needle in one direction or the other.
Great. Okay, I think, were there any other last questions? We had one more. Okay, this will be our last question.
Hello, my name is Matthew Brophy. I'm a professor of philosophy at High Point University. I teach technology ethics. Phenomenal talk. I really enjoyed it. And I like the library behind you from Blade Runner, and my question kind of relates to that, because I'm wondering, how do we decide when AI has crossed that line? Because it passed the Turing test this past summer, ChatGPT 4.5, right? And so according to Alan Turing, that would have been, I think, that it's conscious. But I think, as you recognize and everybody else recognizes, it's not conscious. So what exactly is the test now? Is it the Voight-Kampff test from Blade Runner, or something from Ex Machina? Like, how would you imagine that test? Because we want to make sure we don't make a mistake, because a lot of people are making mistakes already. I think I heard some statistic, like a third of Gen Y, Gen Z, a third of them thought that their chatbots were conscious. Now, I imagine that's more of the 13-year-olds probably, but there are people who have made mistakes about this. So what is exactly the test to determine whether it's crossed the line you talk about?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question, and particularly the love for Blade Runner. I actually write about Blade Runner extensively in the book, and I hope you like that portion of it. Even though those of you who don't like philosophy might like that part. For me, the message, everybody gets Blade Runner wrong. They all think the question is whether Deckard is a replicant. Blade Runner is asking whether we're all replicants. The Voight-Kampff test is a test for empathy towards a non-human species, animals. And if you fail the test, as the replicants do, we kill you. So wait, we're giving you a test to see your empathy towards a non-human species, and you're a non-human species, and so because you don't empathize with the non-human species we like, we're going to kill you? Who's failing the Voight-Kampff test there? I think it's human beings, not the replicants. Okay, so what's our test going to be? I agree. John Searle tried to kill the Turing test philosophically, as I try and explain in the book, and I hope you would agree. Some of his arguments are unconvincing, though he's right about ChatGPT. He's not right about all possible AI. In the book, I offer three possibilities. One possibility is that we would have an entity which actually plausibly could say, no, I have learned in the same way a human child learns. When I understand chair, it's not because I have a definition of chair that's in a dictionary and I know how to manipulate those words so that the syntactical patterns appear to make sense to you. I've actually fallen over chairs. I've lifted chairs. I've been told to take a chair. I've made a chair with my robotic manipulators. The more we have that kind of embodied intelligence and interaction with the world and not the word, the harder it will be for us to say you are qualitatively different. The second thing that I think might lead us to give entities to recognize them is if we had innovation that is genuinely genre transcending, that is truly above and beyond anything that is derived from prior human knowledge. It's one thing to have ChatGPT dig in the scientific literature and come out with an emergent property of an insight. It's another thing to revolutionize the entire field and to make us realize we're looking at everything wrong. If AI started to do that, we would no longer think of them as mere chatbots, mere autocomplete mechanisms, because we would have to say they're doing something that goes beyond that. And the third thing, and this will strike the AI doomers as absolutely horrific, is the possibility of AI forming communities, of it showing moral concern for its own kind and not just for us. Aristotle said that language is important not because of what it lets us do instrumentally, but because of what it lets us be morally as a community. If we saw AI that seemed to have fellow feeling for other AI, I think that might make us change our minds. Those are three predictions about the kinds of things that might move the needle. Whether those are also claims about what should move the needle is a subject for an entire philosophy course, which I would love to teach with you. Thanks so much.